just briefly, this is some information that came out of a report that came out last summer by Professor Sir John Lawton. It was an independent report the government commissioned, and it was actually looking at protected areas in England and asking the question, are they still serving their function? Are they still doing what we need them to do in a changed and different world? And one of the, just to set the scene, he pointed out that we've actually got 3 different tiers of protected area in the UK, and we all knew that, but it's actually been quite surprisingly useful to have him come and tidy it up for us like this. And tier 1 are the sites which are primarily for nature conservation. They've got a very high level of protection, and they cover about 6.1% of the land area of England. I think of the whole UK, we're looking at just hovering around 7% of these types of sites, but I haven't actually been able to check that statistic because of broadband trouble. And then the other 2 laser sites, tier 2, are sites which have been identified as being of high biodiversity value, but they're not got full statutory protection. They're often referred to as local wildlife sites, and the sort of protection they get might be that they're in a strategic plan somewhere as designated area that's important for nature conservation. So if a development proposal comes in, the planners will take account of that, but it'll just be one of the things they take account of when they're balancing the needs of society to decide what's best to decide for other planning development. And so that's quite a vague level of protection, and in some planning authorities they treat it very seriously, and in others they treat it less seriously. But it also enables landowners access to grants to help them manage the land, particularly under something we have in Europe called agri-environment schemes. And then tier 3, which are actually much bigger, these are areas designated for landscape, cultural, recreation, but they do have a statutory purpose for nature conservation, but it's not very tightly controlled in the same way that tier 1 says. Tier 3 are the areas, well, the biggest part of this tier are the areas we call national parks. So I have to be quite careful when I'm talking to an international audience about this, because it's not what national parks mean in most countries. For a start, they're not national and they're not parks. They're not nature reserves. They are actually large planning areas. And we've got some of the most famous places that you've heard of in the world, like the Lake District is a national park, the Peak District. The New Forest in the south of England is a national park, and the South Downs. So some of our most iconic cultural landscapes are national parks, and they're not really conserved for biodiversity, but that's part of what they're conserved for. But there are some other completely unprotected components of ecological networks which are very important biodiversity assets to our country. That's things like farmland and woodland and rivers, which are very important because there's a lot of them. They're a very important part of our whole landscape, and they're managed in mostly part of our rural environment. But there's also a lot of components of the networks which are very important to people. So our green belts are the areas around cities which are protected from development, country and municipal parks, urban and green space, and even people's vegetable gardens and private gardens. They do have an ecological role to play, and they have an enormous role to play in people's lives and in people's understanding and experience of biodiversity, which we're increasingly finding is very good for people's health and gives emotional and mental health, which then of course feeds into their disease resistance and so on. So this is from one of our indicators, so this feeds into the talk I'll be giving later about indicators. Ignore the red and the blue lines, because I don't want to burden you with a lot of detail about our different types of protected areas. These are all tier 1 sites, so that most highly protected areas. If you look at the top line, which is the green one, you can see that in the UK we're sort of heading up towards about 4 million hectares of very strictly protected land. I don't want to give you a percentage, but it's less than 10% and more than 6%. I would not like to give you inaccurate information. So this is published indicator data. And just something that's a very important point I need to make about our most protected sites. They're not just protected in a negative way to stop people destroying them. They're also protected because they're supposed to be properly managed to maintain their biodiversity interest. So in the early 2000s, the government had a very strict target for the whole of the UK, divided up into different countries. 95% of these sites had to be favourable or unfavourable recovering condition by the end of last year. I don't want to go into the details of what exactly favourable and unfavourable recovery means. It's quite contentious in some respects. We have a lot of guidance available to help people make these decisions, and I've not come to tell you about it. In England, about 30% of that sites, not area, reached favourable condition, but 63% were actually being properly managed with proper management plans, proper resources in place, so they were judged to be unfavourable recovery. So I think that was the middle of last year, they'd got to 93% and their target was 95%. I haven't actually heard if they've officially ticked the 95% box, but whether they did or whether they didn't, I think they did extremely well. I'm not responsible for implementing this. This was our conservation agency for England, Natural England, and they have achieved at least 93% on this target, and I think they really are to be commended, and I have no personal stake in that. I think it was a real success.
Can I just stop you there?
Yes.
Because this is quite an interesting point. The idea of
having a target which is set but not met, but is still seen as a success, is a very alien concept in Hong Kong. I know from the way that the air quality targets are set, they're set so to make sure we can meet them today, rather than being a goal that drives change. Now, from my discussion with Vicky earlier, one of the things we discussed about was how creating targets creates pressure to do more and to do better. But the fact that, this last point here, 63%, were under management, and so qualified as unfavourable, to my mind there should be a comma, but recovering, says that there's progress that's been made. And I think that maybe this is something we could think about in Hong Kong. It's not just having a target which is a pass or fail, but at the degrees to which we're actually achieving a target, or that there's a clear evidence that progress is being made towards a target, might be something that we think about.
Well, certainly, recovering is a big step ahead of degrading or being developed or whatever.
yeah, agree.
There is a talk about the indicators and targets later, so that might be a good time to revisit that. So I'm now going to move on to talk about ecological networks, which again the Lawton report has primed us for, and we've also very recently had a publication of the Natural Environment White Paper, which has picked up a lot of these ideas, and the government has made some commitments towards them. So the points I'd like you to remember about ecological networks are, it is an effective concept to use where your wildlife has been fragmented, and where wildlife has been fragmented, it's nearly always been human beings that have done it. So the UK landscape certainly falls into that category of being very highly fragmented, and we are aware of the need to try to join up our biodiversity and make it more resilient and stronger, so that it can cope with what we're throwing at it now and the changes we might throw at it in the future. And at the core of an ecological network is a suite of high quality sites, so there would be around that tier 1, tier 2 sort of level that I've already spoken of. And in the network concept you try to establish some ecological connections between these sites. It's an idea that's having its day globally, and we are aware of well over 250 ecological networks that have been in the pipeline around the world, and we're certainly hoping that maybe a dozen will be in England, in fact, in the term of this government. So the sort of slogan or motto from the Lawton report, which has been quite influential in the UK, was that nature needs space, and that sites for nature, we need to have more of them, they need to be bigger, they need to be better quality, so that's managed properly, and they need to be joined up. Not in every single case, every wildlife site doesn't have to be joined up with every other, but they need broadly to be more joined up. And the report was suggesting that we need to improve the quality of our current sites by better habitat management. And as I showed you earlier, the tier 1 sites are in quite a good state, but the tier 2 sites are not. We're pretty sure of that. they want to, where relevant and appropriate, increase the size of existing sites, particularly to give them buffer areas, which a lot of them don't have at the moment. They want to enhance the connections that already exist between them, and then perhaps more radically, we need to create new sites, have new wildlife areas, and we need to reduce the pressure on wildlife in those sites by improving the quality of the wider environment. Sometimes people use the word, intellectuals sometimes grumble about it, but there is a concept that you can perhaps make your wider environment more permeable for wildlife, just a bit more wildlife friendly, whilst still using it primarily for another purpose, which is usually feeding yourselves, or possibly as a transport network. So to actually improve the wider environment as well as the special sites. And this is a much easier way to understand it because it's a picture worth 1,000 of my words. And this picture's been doing the rounds in the UK and people have been keen on it. The big green blobs are the core areas, perhaps usually a tier 1 or a tier 2 site. The 3 types of corridors that are imagined that could join them up would be just a linear corridor. In Britain this is very often a hedgerow, but it could be any sort of habitat. A landscape corridor is a wider, more mixed, more mosaic and sort of heterogeneous set of habitats. So that might be some bushes, some bits of long grass, some bits of short grass, maybe some heathland, whatever. And then there's also this concept of stepping stone corridors. Of course, not all species can use all types of corridors, but this is increasing the joined up connectedness of the whole system. And then this light green area is not labelled on here, but that's an area for sustainable use, so perhaps low input farming or quite a lot of recreational use, although we're very much against, as a general rule, cutting the public out of any of our reserves. We want the public to come and enjoy nature. So the greener area, the light green area, is the more permeable landscape that's around. And in the UK that's often supported by agri-environment scheme money to help farmers use fewer chemicals or leave corners and gaps of their fields. So this is just a picture of a bit of English countryside, just to show that we have already got some sort of network going on. I'm sorry I can't tell you where this is because it wasn't credited in the report I wrote it from. But there's quite a lot of linear habitats here, rows of trees, hedgerows. I think there's probably a river, and then there's some more biodiverse, wildlife-rich habitat on the top of the hill. And you can see it's quite well linked already. A network approach might look at linking that more. And then this is a winter photograph. I think that's probably Wharfdale. And although it doesn't, you can't see much biodiversity here because it's dormant, because it's winter. In fact, this grassland will be very species rich, as well as the hilltops. And this is quite well connected already. There's a river in the bottom. There's quite a lot of. You could possibly, some conservationists would want to think about having more trees. But the big challenge in this sort of landscape is to get it managed properly. Particularly these enclosed fields, which are traditionally managed. There is still a problem with over fertilisation there, and sometimes of taking the hay crop at not quite the best time. So management needs to be addressed in that landscape. And then the last bit of this talk is an example. It's one that's close to where I live, in fact. You don't have fens in Hong Kong, I know, but I'm hoping some of the concepts will resonate with you. This is the Great Fen Project. It's been in the planning for at least 10 years, I should think. And it's a large area, 3,700 hectares. There's a little village at the top there. That is actually a suburb of the city of Peterborough. There's a big city just to the north of it, with quite, for UK, quite a large sort of deprived population who don't have a great deal of access to sort of friendly countryside. And it's very low-lying, flat, drained land. It's peaty. It's used for growing food. Nearly all those squares are fields growing very valuable crops. It's also used as flood storage because it's low-lying, and this is land that can be flooded. It's got 2 tier 1 sites in it, protected up to the hill. So we've got all the protection we can throw at them. This is one of the oldest nature reserves in the world. It was set up in Victorian times, and this is a wooded nature reserve also on the peat. Both of these reserves are suffering from water quality problems, partly through being used as the flood storage, and because they are very isolated, the species list, the decline in the species are going down and down. And Yes, at the top there was a big lake that was drained by the Victorians and converted into farmland. Peaty soils, right across here, lots of peat. And peat, of course, is carbon. And as the land dries, the peat oxidises and goes into the air. And they calculated that it's, whilst drained like this, it's emitting about 325,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. So there is obviously a carbon emission problem with this. So the vision, a partnership of local authorities and utilities and so on got together, had a vision for this area. That's what it was like at the start of the project. This is what they have planned to do. Obviously, that's a made-up photograph. They want to restore the low-lying marshland to that whole area, embedding the 2 existing reserves and buffering them. It will be still used for flood storage, and of course it will massively increase the flood storage capacity, which, with the threat of more flooding in the future, is very important to us. There will be access, very wide access, to nearly all of the reserve, well, the area, and we are hoping that ultimately people will travel just to see the site because it's going to be so amazing. There will be some sort of small-scale traditional industries that can come in, like really old-fashioned things like reed cropping they're suggesting, but also grazing, wildlife-friendly meat, marketing it and so on. It's already got some very good species, and they've had some new bird species moving in. Certainly seen cranes there, I'm not sure if they've bred. And a lot of scope for awareness raising, involving the public, teaching people about wildlife. So it's, it is a very exciting vision, even more exciting than that. This was from their newsletter, their latest newsletter, which shows the area, and all these green areas, darker green areas, less bilious green, they've already managed to acquire that land. The project secured lottery funding, and they've been able to buy a lot of land, and this area they've already started restoring. So I was there on Christmas Day. I can go, it's quite close to where I live, I can go there whenever I like, and I could see, this is all now turning into marshland and graze areas. These areas, they've just started. It will take a long time, it's a 50-year plan, but in fact they've got about half the land already in the first few years of operation. They're really very excited about it. So again, I wanted to put in a good news story, because this is a really good example, I think, of an ecological network and a restoration and getting back to some of the habitats we've lost. And it carries immense benefits to us as a society. But not everybody sees them, agrees with those benefits. I do have, because it is an agricultural area, I do know people that just say this is a waste of good farming land, we should be feeding the world with this land. And then you have to talk about carbon, you have to talk about flood storage and so on. Because obviously generations of East Anglians have poured their labour into that land to drain it and to grow crops on it. They didn't know they were releasing all that carbon dioxide, they weren't doing anything wrong. And now we're wanting to turn it back to something different. I think that's my last. I know it's not. Yeah, I just wanted to say that there's been a good artistic project on the Great Fen. About 50 artists, I think, were involved, and all over a year all came and made artworks on the Fen, and they've published this book. The Langford Press has published this really very nice book, and it's just an example of some of the artworks that came out of it. And that's perhaps a nice example of how that special place and its biodiversity can be used also to involve people and to make them think about their world and their biodiversity and bring them in and reach people in perhaps a less scientific way than most of my work. And that is the end of this section, so thank you very much.